You were told you were special. Maybe you were gifted. Maybe you showed signs early. The prodigy, the natural, the one who didn't have to try. And somewhere in that recognition, a quiet lie took root. The talent alone would carry you. That the world would make room for your brilliance simply because it exists. But here's what they didn't tell you. Talent is a seed, not a harvest. It's potential energy, dormant and self-contained, waiting for the alchemy of application. And while you were polishing your gifts in isolation, someone else, someone perhaps less naturally endowed, learned to solve problems. They learned to show up. They learned to be needed. And the world, in its brutal pragmatism, chose them. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. The world doesn't reward what you could be. It rewards what you do. It doesn't care about your interior genius, your private masterpieces, your unrealized symphonies. It cares about one thing. Can you make something better? Can you fill a void? Can you be useful? This isn't a betrayal of artistry or depth. This is the ancient law of value. And once you understand it, once you stop waiting to be discovered and start learning to be indispensable, everything changes. The question isn't whether you're talented. The question is, when the world calls, will you be ready to answer? Let's begin with the myth that haunts us all, the myth of the chosen one. You know the story. You've seen it in every hero's tale, every cultural narrative that promised you were different. Born under a rare star, marked by destiny, gifted with abilities that would inevitably elevate you above the ordinary. This narrative seeps into your bones early. Your parents saw it in you. Your teachers whispered it. And somewhere along the way, you began to believe that your talent was a guarantee, a cosmic contract ensuring your eventual triumph. But what if I told you that this belief, this seductive, identity-forming belief, is one of the most disempowering ideas you'll ever carry? What if the very notion that you are chosen by virtue of your gifts is precisely what keeps you from actualizing those gifts in the world? Carl Jung spoke of the persona, the mask we wear, the identity we construct to interface with society. But beneath the persona lies something more primal, the self, the integrated totality of who we are beyond the roles we play. The tragedy of the talented is that they conflate their gifts with their identity. They become their potential. And in doing so, they create a prison of expectation. The pianist who cannot play unless the conditions are perfect. The writer who cannot write unless inspired. The entrepreneur who cannot execute unless the idea is revolutionary. They are waiting, always waiting, for the world to recognize what they already know about themselves. But the world isn't waiting. The world is moving. And it moves toward those who solve its problems, not those who announce their readiness to be worshipped. Consider Nietzsche's concept of resentment, the festering bitterness that arises when one's internal sense of superiority collides with external irrelevance. The talented, unrealized individual often harbors this poison. They watch lesser talents succeed. They see mediocrity rewarded, and they grow resentful, bitter, convinced that the world is blind, that society is broken, that their genius is too advanced to be appreciated. But this is a delusion, a defense mechanism against a simpler, harsher truth. They have not made themselves useful. Talent, in its raw form, is inert. It is a capability, a potential configuration of skill and insight. But potential is invisible. It lives in your mind, in your private rehearsals, in the projects you plan but never finish. The world cannot value what it cannot see. And more importantly, the world cannot use what it cannot access. This is where usefulness diverges from talent. Usefulness is talent externalized. It is the decision to take what you know, what you can do, and direct it toward a problem, a need, a gap in the fabric of someone else's reality. It is the movement from self-regard to service, from internal perfection to external impact. And this movement requires something talent alone cannot provide. It requires humility. It requires the willingness to be wrong, to be needed in ways you didn't anticipate, to reshape your gifts according to the contours of actual human need rather than your own idealized vision. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, understood this deeply. He wrote, "Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be. Be one. Not what a good man could be, not what a good man might become under ideal circumstances, but be one. In the messy, imperfect present." Usefulness is the practice of being, not the promise of becoming. And here's the deeper psychological wound. When you identify too strongly with your talent, every request to use it in a way that feels beneath you becomes a threat to your identity. Someone asks you to solve a simple problem, to contribute in a mundane way, and you recoil. That's not what I'm meant for, you think. I'm destined for greater things. But in that recoil, you reveal the trap. You've made your talent into an idol, and you've become its priest, protecting it from the contamination of ordinary use. Meanwhile, the person who shows up, who solves the simple problem without fanfare, becomes essential. They build trust. They create value. They integrate themselves into the infrastructure of other people's lives. And one day you look up and realize they have the career, the influence, the opportunities you thought were reserved for people like you. Because they understood something you didn't. They understood that power doesn't flow to the most gifted. It flows to the most necessary. This is the death of the chosen one. Not a tragedy, but a liberation. Because once you stop waiting to be recognized for what you are, you can start becoming what the world needs. And in that becoming, you discover something far more potent than talent. You discover agency. You discover that you don't need permission to be valuable. You only need to see where you're needed and move toward it with everything you have. Now let's talk about the marketplace. Not just the economic marketplace, but the marketplace of attention, of opportunity, of human regard. Because this is where the distinction between talent and usefulness becomes ruthlessly clear. The world operates on an economy of exchange, not an economy of potential, not an economy of fairness, but an economy of solved problems. You might possess extraordinary intelligence, dazzling creativity, rare insight. But if those qualities remain locked inside your subjectivity, inaccessible to others, they have no market value. Zero. They might give you private satisfaction, a sense of superiority, even moments of transcendent self-awareness. But they won't pay your rent. They won't build your career. They won't create the life you imagine for yourself. Because value, in the eyes of the world, is determined not by what you contain, but by what you deliver. This is where many talented people experience their first existential crisis. They emerge from environments, schools, families, social circles, where their talent was recognized and celebrated. They were the smart one, the artistic one, the one with potential. And they internalized a narrative. I am valuable because of what I am. But then they enter the broader world and they discover a shocking truth. No one cares what you are. They care what you can do for them. Adam Smith, in The Wealth of Nations, introduced the concept of specialization and exchange, the idea that prosperity emerges not from self-sufficiency, but from mutual usefulness. You produce what I need. I produce what you need. The blacksmith doesn't marvel at his own ability to shape metal. He directs that ability toward the creation of tools others can use. And in that exchange, both parties are elevated. But the talented person often resists this exchange. They want to be valued for their essence, not their output. They want recognition without application. And this resistance stems from a deep psychological wound. The fear that if they reduce themselves to usefulness, they will lose their uniqueness, their specialness, their soul. But this is a false dichotomy. Usefulness doesn't erase your depth, it proves it. Anyone can harbor grand visions in private. Anyone can believe themselves capable of greatness in the abstract. But the person who could take their interior vision and translate it into something that serves another person, that person has achieved something far more difficult. They have bridged the gap between self and world. They have made the invisible visible. Consider the artist. The romantic image of the artist is the isolated genius, creating purely for the sake of creation, indifferent to audience or acclaim. But even the most uncompromising artists, Joyce, Beckett, Rothko, were engaged in a form of usefulness. They were solving aesthetic problems, filling voids in the cultural imagination, offering structures of meaning to those who encountered their work. Their usefulness was subtle, complex, not transactional in the crude sense. But it was usefulness nonetheless. And here's the paradox. The more useful you become, the more freedom you acquire. Because usefulness creates trust, and trust creates access. Access to resources, to opportunities, to collaborations, to platforms. The person who reliably solves problems is given more problems to solve, not as a burden, but as an invitation into greater arenas of influence. The talented person without usefulness remains perpetually on the outside, pressing their face against the glass, wondering why the world won't let them in. But the useful person doesn't wait for invitations. They make themselves indispensable, and the doors open naturally. This is the brutal economics of value. The world is not a talent show. It's a problem-solving ecosystem. And those who orient themselves toward problems rather than toward their own specialness discover a strange truth. They become more fulfilled, more actualized, more themselves, not less. Because usefulness is not a betrayal of your gifts, it's the maturation of them. Dostoevsky explored this tension in Crime and Punishment. Raskolnikov believes himself a superior man, entitled to transcend conventional morality because of his exceptional intellect. But his brilliance, disconnected from service, from love, from humility, becomes monstrous. It's only when he descends from his pedestal of exceptionalism and enters into genuine human relationship, when he becomes useful to Sonia, when he allows her to be useful to him, that redemption becomes possible. The lesson is ancient and unavoidable. You are not too special to be useful. Your gifts were not given to you for decoration. They were given to you to be spent, to be directed outward, to be worn down in the service of something larger than your own self-image. And in that spending, in that wearing down, you don't lose yourself. You find yourself. You discover what your talent was always meant for. Not admiration, but transformation. Not applause, but impact. So the question becomes, are you willing to step down from the throne of potential and enter the arena of actuality? Are you willing to let your gifts be shaped by need rather than by your idealized vision of what you should become? Because once you make that shift, once you stop protecting your talent and start deploying it, the world stops being an obstacle and becomes a collaborator. And you stop being a promise and become a presence. There is a structure to power that the talented often fail to recognize. It's not built on genius. It's not built on originality. It's built on consistency, on responsiveness, on the quiet accumulation of trust through repeated usefulness. This is the architecture of indispensability, and it operates according to principles that have nothing to do with how special you are. Let me tell you what makes someone indispensable. They show up. They deliver. They anticipate needs before they're articulated. They solve problems without seeking credit. They make other people's lives easier, smoother, more functional. And over time, almost imperceptibly, they become integrated into the infrastructure of the organizations, relationships, and communities they serve. Removing them would require a redesign. And redesigns are costly, risky, difficult, so they stay. They rise, not because they're the most talented, but because they've made themselves necessary. Compare this to the trajectory of the talented but unreliable person. They dazzle occasionally. They produce moments of brilliance. But they're inconsistent. They need the right mood, the right conditions, the right inspiration. They take feedback as personal attack. They vanish when the work becomes tedious. And slowly, quietly, they are routed around. People stop depending on them. Opportunities go to others. Not because they lack ability, but because they lack dependability. And dependability is the foundation of all lasting influence. Kierkegaard wrote about the concept of repetition, the idea that true freedom and selfhood emerge not from constant novelty, but from the willingness to commit, to return, to deepen through sustained engagement. The talented person is often addicted to novelty. They want each project to be a revelation, each endeavor to confirm their exceptionalism. But the useful person understands that most of life's value is created through repetition, through the willingness to do the unsexy work again and again, until it compounds into something undeniable. This is why the craftsman often outlasts the genius. The craftsman has humility. They know their work is not about them. It's about the chair, the table, the structure they're building. And because their ego is not entangled with every decision, they can receive feedback, adjust, improve. They can work within constraints. They can collaborate. They can subordinate their vision to the needs of the project. And in doing so, they become essential. The genius, by contrast, is often brittle. Their identity is so fused with their output that any criticism feels like annihilation. They cannot adapt because adaptation feels like compromise, and compromise feels like death. So they remain rigid, insisting the world meet them on their terms. And the world, indifferent to their demands, moves on. But here's where it gets interesting. Indispensability is not about self-erasure. It's not about becoming a cog, a servant, a tool for others' agendas. It's about strategic positioning. It's about understanding where your capabilities intersect with genuine need and then owning that intersection. When you become the person who solves a particular problem better than anyone else, you gain leverage. You gain autonomy. You gain the freedom to shape your role according to your values. This is the paradox the talented miss. By trying to preserve their uniqueness through aloofness, they lose their power. But by making themselves useful, by integrating into the needs of others, they gain the very autonomy they were trying to protect. Think of it as Jungian integration. You have a shadow, the parts of yourself you've disowned, the capacities you've deemed beneath you. For many talented people, usefulness lives in the shadow. It feels servile, transactional, beneath their dignity. But Jung taught that integration requires reclaiming the shadow, incorporating what you've rejected. And when you do, when you embrace the power of usefulness without resentment, you become whole. You become functional in the world without losing your interiority. You can be both deep and practical, both visionary and reliable. The architecture of indispensability is simple. Identify a need. Develop the capacity to meet that need consistently. Deliver without drama. Repeat. Over time, you become part of the load-bearing structure of whatever system you're in, and systems protect what they need. This is how influence is actually built, not through grand gestures or isolated moments of brilliance, but through the patient accumulations of trust. And trust is built through usefulness, through showing up when it's inconvenient, through solving problems no one else wants to touch, through making the success of others feel dependent, in some small but real way, on your continued presence. And here's the final insight. Once you become indispensable, you can start to shape the system itself. You're no longer on the outside. petitioning for entry. You're on the inside, with your hands on the levers. And from that position, you can introduce your vision, your values, your unique perspective, not as an outsider demanding recognition, but as an insider with earned authority. So the question is, are you building toward indispensability, or are you waiting to be crowned? Because the crown never comes. But the quiet, compounding power of usefulness that's available to you right now. You just have to be willing to put your gifts to work. There comes a moment in every talented person's life when they must choose. Remain a person of potential or become a person of presence. These are not compatible identities. One lives in the future, the other lives now. One is defined by promise, the other by proof. And the transition from one to the other requires a kind of death, the death of the idealized self. Potential is intoxicating. It's the story you tell yourself about who you'll become when the conditions are right. When you have more time, more resources, more recognition. When the world finally understands you. Potential is safe because it can never be disproven. As long as you haven't fully committed, as long as you're still preparing, your talent remains pristine, untested, perfect in its abstraction. But presence is vulnerable. Presence means showing up with what you have, where you are, even if it's not enough. Presence means your work can be judged, criticized, rejected. Presence means you might fail. And for the person who has built their identity around being talented, failure is not just a setback, it's an existential threat. Because if you're talented and you fail, what does that make you? This is the terror that keeps potential locked away. But it's also a delusion, because failure, in the context of usefulness, is not the end of your value. It's information. It's feedback. It's the beginning of iteration, of refinement, of becoming actually good at something, rather than theoretically capable of it. Jung called this process individuation, the journey toward becoming who you actually are, rather than who you imagine yourself to be. And individuation requires confrontation with reality. It requires taking your internal vision and testing it against the external world. Most people avoid this confrontation because they're afraid of discovering that they're not as special as they believed. But the paradox is, those who undergo this confrontation, who risk their potential in the service of actual presence, often discover capacities they didn't know they had. They become more than they imagined, not less. Consider the concept of amor fati, Nietzsche's injunction to love your fate, to embrace what is rather than clinging to what could be. The person of potential is always at war with their circumstances. If only I had better resources, better support, better timing. But the person of presence accepts the constraints and works within them. They don't wait for permission or perfect conditions. They act. And in acting, they shape their circumstances rather than being shaped by them. This is where usefulness becomes a spiritual practice, because usefulness demands presence. You cannot be useful in the abstract. You can only be useful here, now, for this person, with this problem. Usefulness roots you in the concrete, in the immediate, in the undeniable reality of what's in front of you. And in that rooting, you escape the prison of your own potential. There's a story from the Zen tradition about a student who asks the master, "What is enlightenment?" The master replies, "When hungry, eat. When tired, sleep." The student is confused. This seems too simple. But the master explains, most people, even when eating, are not truly eating. They're thinking about the past or worrying about the future. They're not present. Enlightenment is presence, fully inhabiting what is. The talented person, waiting to be recognized, is never fully present. They're always slightly removed, observing themselves, comparing their current state to their imagined future. But the useful person, the person engaged in solving an actual problem, has no choice but to be present. The problem demands it, and in that demand, they find focus, clarity, purpose. They stop narrating their lives and start living them. This shift from potential to presence also transforms how you relate to failure. When you're a person of potential, failure is catastrophic. It threatens the story you've told yourself. But when you're a person of presence, failure is mundane. It's just part of the process. You tried something, it didn't work, you adjust. Your identity isn't at stake because your identity isn't dependent on being right or brilliant. It's dependent on being engaged, on being in motion, on being useful. And here's what happens. As you accumulate experiences of presence, of showing up, of solving problems, of being useful even when it's difficult, you build a different kind of confidence. Not the fragile confidence of potential, which collapses at the first sign of difficulty, but the durable confidence of competence, the confidence that says, I don't know if I can solve this, but I know I can figure it out. I know I can learn. I know I can contribute. This is the birth of presence, and it's more powerful than potential ever was, because potential is a story about the future, but presence is a fact about now. And the world responds to facts, not stories. So the question becomes, are you willing to let your potential die? Are you willing to trade the safety of your imagined greatness for the risk of actual contribution? Because on the other side of that, death is not diminishment, it's liberation. You stop being haunted by what you could be and start becoming what you are. And what you are, when you're present, when you're engaged, when you're useful, is always enough. We arrive now at the deepest paradox of all, that in the movement toward usefulness, toward service, toward directing your gifts outward rather than hoarding them inward, you do not lose yourself, you discover yourself. This is the alchemy of service, the transformation that occurs when you stop using your talent as an identity and start using it as a tool. There is an old spiritual teaching, found in various forms across traditions, that the self is most fully realized not in isolation, but in relationship, not in withdrawal, but in engagement. The hermit on the mountain may achieve a kind of purity, but the person in the marketplace, solving problems, serving needs, interacting with the complexity of human life, that person is undergoing a different kind of refinement, a more complete kind. When you make yourself useful, you enter into a feedback loop with reality. Reality pushes back. It tells you what works and what doesn't. It reveals the gap between your self-concept and your actual capabilities. And yes, this can be painful. Your ego will resist. But this resistance is precisely the friction that shapes you. The stone that remains in the river is polished smooth. The stone that sits on the shore remains rough, untouched, unchanged. Jung spoke of the transcendent function, the capacity of the psyche to hold opposites in tension until a new synthesis emerges. Talent and usefulness are not opposites, but they feel like opposites to the person who has over-identified with one. The talented person believes that usefulness diminishes them. But through the transcendent function, through the willingness to engage both, a new identity emerges. The person who is both gifted and grounded, both visionary and practical, both unique and connected. This is the mature self, not the self that insists on its specialness, but the self that has integrated its gifts into a larger fabric of meaning and service. And paradoxically, this self is more unique, not less, because anyone can remain abstract, untested, full of potential. But the person who has taken their gifts and refined them through the crucible of actual use, that person has become something rare. They have become effective. There is a passage in the Bhagavad Gita where Arjuna the warrior is paralyzed by doubt on the battlefield. He doesn't want to fight. He's conflicted, philosophical, aware of the complexity of his situation. And Krishna tells him, essentially, Your duty is to act, not to control the outcome, not to ensure success, but to act according to your nature, your dharma. For Arjuna, a warrior, that means fighting. For you, a person of gifts, it means using those gifts, not perfectly, not with guaranteed results, but with commitment, with presence, with the willingness to serve something larger than your own comfort. This is where service becomes sacred, not service in the degraded sense, the servile, resentful service of the oppressed, but service in the sacred sense, the offering of your highest capacities toward the alleviation of suffering, the creation of beauty, the solving of problems, the betterment of the world you inhabit. This kind of service doesn't diminish you, it consecrates you. And here's what you discover. The more you serve, the more you are served. Not in a transactional way, not in a karmic accounting system, but in the natural flow of reciprocity that governs human relationships. When you make yourself useful, people want to support you. They want to collaborate with you. They want to see you succeed because your success is connected to their well-being. You become part of a network of mutual benefit, and that network carries you further than you could ever go alone. The talented person, isolated in their potential, has no such network. They are alone with their gifts, waiting for the world to come to them. And the world, busy solving problems with the people who show up, forgets they exist. But the useful person is woven into the fabric of community. They are remembered. They are valued, not because they're the most talented, but because they're there. And being there, consistently, usefully, transforms everything. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "What is not good for the beehive cannot be good for the bee." He understood that individual flourishing is inseparable from collective flourishing. When you make yourself useful, you are not sacrificing yourself for others. You are aligning yourself with the deeper structure of human thriving. You are acting in accordance with the reality that we are social animals, that our fulfillment comes not from isolation, but from contribution. And in that contribution, you find meaning, not the hollow meaning of recognition or applause, but the deep meaning of knowing that you matter, that your presence makes a difference, that the world is slightly better because you were here and because you chose to use what you were given. This is the final liberation, when you no longer need to be the most talented person in the room, when you no longer need to be recognized as special, when you can simply show up, see what's needed, and offer what you have without reservation or resentment. This is freedom. This is power. This is the life your gifts were always meant to create. So here is the invitation. Stop waiting. Stop polishing your potential in private. Stop protecting your talent from the contamination of ordinary use. Take what you have, however incomplete, however imperfect, and direct it toward a problem, a person, a need. Make yourself useful, not because you're not talented, but because your talent means nothing until it touches the world. And in that touching, in that contact, in that movement from self to other, you will discover something astonishing. You were never meant to be worshipped. You were meant to be alive, fully, messily, courageously alive. And usefulness is the gateway to that aliveness. The world is waiting, not for your perfection, not for your grand arrival, but for your presence, for your willingness to show up and solve the problems in front of you, for your willingness to be needed. And when you finally answer that call, when you trade potential for presence, talent for usefulness, isolation for service, you will look back and realize this was always the path. This was always the way home.